Frédéric Panaïotis, chef de cave of Champagne Ruinart, for this interview. This interview is a bonus of the French Wine Society Champagne Master Level Program, a comprehensive online study and certificate program on the wines of Champagne. Hello, Frédéric.
Hello, bonjour.
Nice to have you with us.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start with the long history of Ruinart. You are famous for being the oldest of the champagne houses. Wine has been produced in the area for a long time before 1729, but could you tell what happened in 1728 to start the champagne production?
Well, there was an important decree from the King of France at the time, who finally allowed the bottling of wine of the region of Champagne. Prior to May 1728, it was actually illegal to put the wine in bottle, and so wine had to be transported mostly towards Paris and the nearby regions by in barrels, and so therefore this made the wine sparkling impossible to produce. So all the wines produced at the time, or I would say all the wines commercialized at the time, had to be still wine. Of course, and the reason was tax, because if you were moving wine from one region to another, you would have to pay tax as any commercial item, and it's easy to hide a bottle or to smuggle a bottle or two, but to smuggle a barrel is a bit more difficult. So mainly it was tax reason. And as you know, when French people have to pay tax, they always become very clever at trying to avoid paying them. So of course, there was already wine being put in bottle, and probably some sparkling wine from Champagne, but it was not commercially legal to do business with them. So the House of Ruinart, and we do have that very first book. The Ruinart family were actually in the trade of fabrics. They decided to expand their business by opening a champagne business on September 1st, 1729. And officially we are the first house, unless somebody proves that they started between May 1728 and September 1729, but that will probably be difficult to prove.
In the are there some records left? What was the style of champagne at the time? How long was the cellaring? What was the sweetness level? Are there any records left?
From the very first years, we do have the archives, I believe, until the mid-30s. We have nothing about this. We have the sales, the sales book, so where the wine's going to, and etc. And then we are missing quite a few years, and I think the archives start back to the early 1760s. And again, very little information. Yes and no, not on the making, but we know that the wines had a very short time of maturation. They were selling them quite quickly. After 2 years, probably, was the norm. So no 10-year on the lease and stuff like that. I mean, at the time there was little protection offered on the wine. I guess they knew about sulfur, using the solid sulfur to put in the barrels, and basically that was the only protection. So I don't think the wines had a lot of potential to age. So the idea was to drink them quite early on.
Okay. At the era, the monks and the monasteries were very important for the development of the different wine styles. Your house history also has a great monk named Dom Ruinart, but he died 20 years before champagne was actually, sparkling champagne was legalized. So what do you
Correct.
know of the influence of what he had on the birth of Ruinart?
Well, he was a very smart man, because he obviously became a don, and don was a level in the hierarchy of monks that you had to deserve by being very literate or very dedicated to something. And obviously, Dom Pérignon became don because of his mastering of winemaking, and our Don Ruinart was more a master of theology, of philosophy. That was his strength. But he was a very smart man. He was very well connected to the court of the King of France. And as I mentioned, we know that there was some wine from Champagne being smuggled into Paris. And what we believe is that he saw the interest of the rich and famous into this amazing wine that had, foam, that was sparkling, that was totally different. And he apparently advised his family that this would be a smart business to do. And so not his nephew, but his brother, who gave birth to his nephew afterwards.
Okay.
So this is the history we have on Don Ruinart being influential in having the idea of creating a champagne business.
What is known about the relationship between the other famous monk, Dom Perignon? Did they know each other? Was there any sharing of information? Is anything known?
They met briefly. They are buried at the same time. We know that on one of his last trip, I forgot where he was coming from, but anyway, he was, Don Ruinart was traveling quite a bit. I think it was within France for sure. And on his way back to Reims, he stopped by the Abbey of Auvillers because he didn't feel very well, and he passed away after 3 months there. So he had another stop before. We know about that in the previous years, but he may have met or not Dom Perignon. I'm sure they met. It was not a huge abbey, but I don't think they talk about wine. Probably not. Or maybe, I don't know. Actually, you know what? At that stage, I really don't know. But they are buried in the same abbey, not far away from each other. So in heaven, they probably look at Dom Perignon and Ruinart being competitors on the market, which is, kind of an interesting point.
Yes, but also the same family, aren't they? In one sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. So how about, you're also famous for being the house that discovered the famous chalk pits on the Butte Saint-Nicaise in Reims, the Crayères, in 1768. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Crayères?
Well, I don't know if we can be credited of discovering them because they've been there for a long time. But the thing is that Champagne requires a lot of space. The storage it's space intensive. So the house in the center of the city, the Ruinart house, probably became too small too quickly, and Claude Ruinart found out that this Crayères, just outside of Reims at the time, they were not. Today obviously the city is bigger, so they're within the boundaries of the city. But at the time, they may have been slightly outside. So, but he went there, knew about them, and it was not hard to figure out that they would be great sellers. So he was the man who developed this area as a storage area and wine making area. What we know about the Crayères is that some of them, the oldest parts, were dug about 2,000 years ago by the Romans, but those were more of the shallow one, maybe down to 5, 6, 10 meters. They're not the deepest ones. The main part of the Crayères, actually, they date back to the Middle Age time, where the chalk was extracted to make some more, what do you call it? A product to build the walls, to put in between the stones. To make sure that the stuff would be, the constructions were good, because chalk is not that great of a material to build buildings. It absorbs a lot of water, which is great because for the cycle of the vine, it's a very important element. That water regulation system. But as a drawback of that, during the winter, if it's outside and if it's still quite wet, it will freeze, and when it freezes, it's going to break. So as a building material, no, not the best.
Very good. The second thing I wanted to ask you about was the role of Chardonnay at the house. We've been mainly talking about the people with the last name Ruinart, but there's also one significant guy whose name is Bernard Muir.
Yes.
Could you tell us
Bertrand Muir.
about him?
Yes, well, this Bertrand Muir was a son-in-law in the Ruinart family, so he didn't bear the name Ruinart, but he was really a Ruinart family member, and he worked at Ruinart a little bit before. I mean, he was in the family, and he told me he was actually living there, you know, in the house where the house is today. Yeah. He told me he remember running into the courtyard and you know, playing with the bottles and stuff like that when he was like a teenager. I think he even worked a little bit when he was like 16 or 17 in the late 30s. Anyway, after World War II, he was the man in charge. He took over, and during the World War II, the house greatly suffered. You know, there were very little wine left to do business. We only had like 10,000 bottles left in the cellar. And when his fairly young man took over, he had to basically start from scratch. We still had our beautiful vineyards of about 20 hectares, not very big. That was the Ruinart vineyards at the time. And his idea was that champagne should not be too pretentious. It should be beautiful, elegant, refined, but also he had a sense that champagne was an important link between people. You know, it's like a social lubricant, if you wish. So his vision of champagne was a wine that had elegance, finesse, freshness, and he understood that Chardonnay was a great variety to achieve that style. Obviously, there was not as much Chardonnay. It was not as popular at the time as it is now. I guess in the mid-40s, Chardonnay was barely 20% of all the Champagne acreage, when now it's 30%. But it was a good decision, and he for sure started to make the first Blanc de Blanc at the house in 1947. So very, very quickly after he took over, he was the one behind Don Ruinart, first vintage in 1959. And the person who took over after him as president of the house, Roland de Calonne, was the one who introduced the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage in 2001.
Okay. So your house is famous for its Chardonnay, but it comes from perhaps unusual locations within Champagne, not just the Côte de Blanc, but also Cézanne and Vallée de la Velle for the non-vintage, and Montagne de Reims for the Don Ruinart. Could you explain this?
Well, true. I think as the idea for the non-vintage Blanc de Blanc is to have a Blanc de Blanc that is quite friendly and accessible with a beautiful freshness, but not only the focus on minerality and sometimes the austerity that the Côte de Blanc can have. So from the beginning, the idea was to source mostly Premier Cru vineyards from the Côte de Blanc a little bit, but also from the Montagne de Reims that bring more citrusy elements, that bring a bit more character, but to tame that Premier Cru quality and aging potential by lesser known areas of Chardonnay, but that are also quite wonderful. The Cézanne brings a beautiful tropical fruit. You're mentioning the Vallée de la Velle that brings, the soil is different. In that part of the Champagne, the soil is more sandy than chalk. And those Chardonnay are very, they age very quickly, they're very gentle, and they're perfect for the non-vintage Blanc de Blanc. Altogether, we source the grapes in about 20 to 25 different villages for the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage. And I think this is really one of the key elements, to have that natural roundness, natural expression. It's very bright, very fruity, very upfront, and that I think this is a quite different Blanc de Blanc than most people think Blanc de Blanc are in Champagne. Now for Don Ruinart, For Don Ruinart, obviously we rely a lot on the Côte des Blancs because this is where some of the top vineyards are. But if you look at the location of the house, Ruinart is in Reims, not in Épernay, a bit more on the northern side. And the historical vineyards for Ruinart, the best Grand Cru vineyard around Reims, is actually Sillery, so the northern side of La Montagne de Reims. And obviously, we had to use Chardonnay from Sillery in our blend. And actually, Chardonnay from Sillery and the neighboring villages such as Puisieux or Verzenay or Mailly, they're very different from the Côte des Blancs. They tend to be a bit more powerful. They have more structure, more power, and they blend very well with the more refined wines from the Côte des Blancs. So I think we have a good recipe for Don Ruinart. And, you know, the 69 Don Ruinart we had together a couple of years ago is, I think, a good proof that those wines can age well.
Yes, absolutely. But so, when people mention Chardonnay from the Montagne de Reims, they would say Répaille or Villers-Marmery. Why don't you choose those two villages?
Because we only have contracted grapes there, and because they're Premier Cru vineyards. So we want to use Grand Cru vineyards only for Don Ruinart. Okay. Honestly, it could be okay, but I think it's just been the recipe for Don Ruinart, and we stick to it, you know. But why not?
Last year was also very exciting for you. You discovered this fantastic records that the oldest existing or knowledge of Champagne Rosé being shipped was actually by you, by today's knowledge. So could you tell what happened in 2013 when you found this?
Well, in 2014, Essie. Yes, actually, I was at my. I was in my office that day, and we had these two ladies working on the Ruinart archives, not trying to specifically look for rosé or something like this, but trying to see in which countries we were exporting at the time. And on the page of the shipments of March 1764, 14th, if I remember well, one of the lady was reading, and she was like, what is that œil de perdrix? So she knew there was something different. She knew œil de perdrix meant rosé. So she came and fetched me in my office and said, Fred, I think I have something very interesting here. And sure enough, in this shipment to the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in the northern part of Germany, out of 120 bottles of Ruinart champagne, were 60 bottles specifically named œil de perdrix, which is partridge eye in English. And we found out a bit later, looking at other documents, that those bottles were meant to be with a pink shade, with a pink tint, because the customers were asking for that. So officially, I guess we can consider that these 60 bottles are the first Champagne Rosé ever shipped.
Is there some history known about the œil de perdrix? I mean, at the time they were obviously not able to or avoid the coloring from the red grapes. That must have been the starting point. But do you know anything about the development of the œil de perdrix?
No, we don't have the winemaking secrets of the time, but we can assume that they were macerating the grapes a little bit longer. You know, from Dom Pérignon, the mastering of pressing the black grapes to obtain very clear wines was actually well understood in Champagne. So I think people already knew how to get rid of the color, or not get rid of the color, but how to not get the color into the wine by harvesting by hand. Well, there was no machines, obviously, but by being very careful at loading the press, at pressing very gently on a large surface, low pressure, slowly. So I guess that getting more color was purposely made, you know, it was made by intention of getting that color, by extracting it, by macerating the grapes, because normally the wines were not that dark, apparently. What is probably less known is that for some time, the technique used afterwards was a bit different. It was champagne used for some time elderflower berry dye or wine to color the champagne, to make it pink. But the quality was not as interesting, not as the flavors were not as right, and the palate apparently was a bit showing more bitterness. And so some of the houses didn't like the technique, and Clicquot was the first house to blend red wine and white wine to make the rosé, and we followed after that at Ruinart. So probably the first rosé we made was maceration, and the technique of blending red wine and white wine for us didn't come probably from the middle of the 1800s, so 1850, something like this.
So to celebrate the newly found old style, are you thinking of recreating an Eau de Pertuis?
Well, not really. We are very happy with the way the wines are today. I very much enjoy the red winemaking part, because I think with the red winemaking, first we use a lot of Chardonnay in our blend, 45% in the non-vintage, up to 80% in the Don Ruinart Rosé. So there's no other technique than blending red wine when you use Chardonnay as a base for your rosé, you know. But even for the non-vintage, I think we've really find a way to make the red wine in a light matter with a short maceration, extracting very little tannins to get a soft feeling, to get the flavor of the Pinot Noir, but not the harshness of the Pinot Noir. And so I think this works very well for us. So I have other ideas about going back to the future, well, going backwards in time, but not this one. But thanks for mentioning it.
So maybe a few more words about the Dom Ruinart Rosé. At least to me, it's quite astonishing if you think that I would never imagine that it is actually the Dom Ruinart Blanc de Blanc base where you add red wine. To me, it is so Burgundian, so winey. Wine, you wouldn't think that it's made from the same base wine. Could you explain that a little?
Well, I can assure you that it is made from the same base, but it's true that the addition of, well, you say it's Burgundy, but you have to admit, and you will concur, that even the Don Ruinart white becomes Burgundian, like a white Burgundy, but sometimes even young, but when it ages, it becomes very Chassagne Montrachet or Puligny Montrachet, or even Corton Charlemagne-like sometimes. But anyway, I digress. The only difference is the addition of that 15 to 20% of red wine, and not your typical Bouzy Rouge, but the red wine is actually usually coming from the northern side of La Montagne de Reims. We macerate and try to make the red wine in a Burgundian way, as much as we can. We don't have the same maturity. The red wine is not as good, believe me. And when we make red wine for rosé, it's not like making red wine for red wine drinking. I think the approach has to be different, right? But what still amazes me is how this blend, after years of aging, turns out. Because it's true that the notes are very different. It becomes, as you mentioned, you have that dry flower expression. At first you have stewed fruit like raspberry, you have some candied orange, but then it becomes, with more aging, it becomes quite spicy, even gamey, and that's very, almost like a red Burgundy. And when they're very old, when you taste an 85 rosé, which you have in your memory, if you close your eyes, you're not in Champagne anymore. You're more in Burgundy territory. So I don't know. I don't want to call it a miracle, but I don't know how it happens exactly. But it works. The technique works for sure.
Most champagne houses would release their rosé, both non-vintage and the prestige cuvée, before the white version of the same wine. But very often it is so that your rosé comes on the market later than the white Dom Ruinart. Why is that?
I think the addition of red wine as being slightly antioxidative tends to slow down the aging. So we are quite happy when we can, which has always been the case so far, but it might not be always possible in the future. We are quite happy to have a difference in vintage between the Dom Ruinart white and the Dom Ruinart rosé. But you know, going back to Burgundy, I think our style, generally speaking, of Ruinart is more reductive than oxidative, and this is a quality I find in the best Burgundy, that nice gentle reduction that you find on white wine, that you also find on the most of the red wines, brings that gamey, spicy, toasty elements that for me are very enjoyable, and I hope for you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Frédéric, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, AC, and until next time we meet. Cheers.
Yeah.